what's up? Welcome back to another episode of Fun with Flags, the show where we teach each other about each other's respective countries. I, myself, who live in Israel, I teach my good buddy Soda about my country, and he lives in Canada, so he teaches me about his country. Kind of messed up with the hand gestures for a second there, but yeah, that's the show. So, Soda, how's your day been?
It's been a surprisingly good day. We're heading into the long weekend the day we were recording this for Easter weekend, so it's going to be fun. Looking forward to this.
And we just hit the first really hot day of the year. And if that's any indication, we're in for a very hot summer year
Oh, it's
this
still
year. And,
springtime.
oh boy, I cannot wait to not wait for that.
Yeah.
So no fancy words, no nothing. Let's just jump straight into the main topic today. We are talking about politicians mainly. We're talking about Israeli leaders, the leaders of Israel. Now, I don't know if many people know this, but Israel, for some reason, just has a prime minister and a president. For some reason, they just balance the two together. Um, but it's really the prime minister that leads the whole structure of the government structure of Israel. Of course, there's also the chairman of the Knesset, which is basically the Israeli parliament, for lack of a better word. But for the most part, it's the prime minister, and the president is more of a representative figure, a public figure. I've been told it's been equated to the queen, or in this case, the king in Great Britain, or the emperor in Japan, where they don't necessarily govern, they don't have any much of a role in any of the crucial decisions, and they're mainly there just to meet diplomats and world leaders, be a public figure, to be a public representative of the people, and they only and specifically, I don't know about other countries, but specifically the president of Israel only really intervenes at uh, important events. Like, well, one thing that I can say is that on a recent case where Israel almost got banned from Eurovision this year because allegedly the lyrics and the title of the song that they chose for Eurovision was quote unquote too political because it was called October Rain. And yeah,
As
to
opposed
that,
to November Rain.
yeah,
By Guns N' Roses.
yeah, of course, we all know what happened in October. So apparently, that makes it political.
Yeah.
Uh, to
Well,
that,
if it is about that, then technically, yes, it is. But not really reason to kick someone out anyways.
yes, and to that I say, give me a fucking break. Have you heard some of the Eurovision songs in previous years? But I digress. So basically the main team led, spearheaded for some reason by Minister of Education, were pretty determined to keep the song as is, even at the cost of being banned from Eurovision. And then the president intervened and kind of forced their hand to change it, deciding that participating in Eurovision was more important than the stupid Minister of Education's ego. And lo and behold, Israel is in Eurovision now, and actually we're one of the more popular songs for this year, according to the reactions that I've been seeing. So yeah, there is obviously, as I mentioned, a prime minister and a president, and we're going to be covering both sides of that political spectrum because in many cases, in many ways, the two kind of really go together hand in hand, especially in more recent years, and we'll get into that once we get to them. But of course, this is all leading up to another topic that I'm planning in a couple more weeks,
Okay.
which you're gonna have to familiarize with at least some of these figures to understand that topic. No spoilers, but I also added another layer to this by also including General Chief of Staffs. The head of the IDF, the Israeli military. Again, all part of the same topic that I'm planning. So yeah, this is basically just a precursor. So really, no point in staying too long on this. So why don't we just go right ahead?
Let's go. Because the boys I'm hungry, anyways. Let's go.
What?
Said your boy's getting hungry.
All right, so let's just wrap this up as fast as we can. Now, of course, I am going to mention the person's name. There's a couple of notes on that Wikipedia thinks is important enough to point out. I'll also be mentioning how many terms they stayed on and which party they belonged to, because again, that's going to come up later. But I think the first person doesn't need any introduction at all because we talked about him enough times. David Ben Gurion.
Yep.
The
Man,
founder,
the myth, the legend.
of this. Yep, the man, the myth, the legend, the founder of the state, and served in no less than 6 terms.
You do not get that over here, because I know in Canada, I believe it's 3 terms is the limit, and in the United States, it's 2. 2? I think it's 2. There are term limits over here.
Yeah, but don't get your hopes up, because apparently at the time a term was just 1 year. According to what Wikipedia says here. So basically, he was from 1948 all the way to 1954.
Oh, so, having an election every year, that would suck.
Yeah, thankfully they changed it later on. But yeah, to go off of your previous point, Israel has no limits. One can get elected for as many times as people continue to vote for them. Now, of course, I mentioned the important notes and in the background. Now, obviously, with this guy, the association is there. So the notes obviously include Israel's War of Independence from 1947 to 1949, the foundation of Israel, 1948, and also 1948, the dismantling of all the freedom fighter brigades like the Haganah, the Palmach, the Etzel, the Lehi, all the quote-unquote freedom fighters who were for lack of a better word, fighting for the Jewish people's freedom in the years prior to the Israel War of Independence. And of course, they were all dismantled and reshaped, reformed to create the Israeli Defense Force, the IDF. Now, also in 1948, there was a mass migration from all the European countries and all the North African and other Middle Eastern countries, because, finally the word gets out that there's a Jewish state in the world. All the Jews of the world want to fulfill the Zionist dream of having a Jewish state. And of course, the numbers ranged from anywhere between 650,000 to 1.3 million people. And then, of course, after that came in 1949 came what is known as the austerity period, which basically Israel was a very tiny country, well, still is, but it was a very poor country in its very first few years. Very lack of resources, lack of agriculture, lack of anything really. So for the first few years of Israel's existence, spearheaded by this guy, of course, it was basically decided to use resources sparingly, including food, water, and all kinds of other resources. It lasted for a couple of years. So there's that, and we are going to talk about when it was lifted in a couple more entries. Next up in 1949 was the Armistice Agreement, also known as the Herod's Agreement. Basically, it was the armistice between Israel and all the other countries that were fighting it, and the drawing of the borders of the state of Israel, which for the most part kind of remain still to this day. Then after that, in 1951, was the reprisal operations. Basically, they were IDF-led raids on Arab activists and terrorists from all the countries that lost the war with Israel, the War of Independence of Israel, who were still targeting Israel after the fact and still killing Jews in Israel and other Israeli citizens after the Israeli War of Independence. And the final note on here in 1952 was the what was it called? The reparation agreements with Western Germany, which basically somewhere between 1953 all the way up to 1965, West Germany delivered a total sum of 3 billion German francs to Israel as sort of
Peace offering.
not necessarily peace, or just compensation for the Holocaust.
Oh, okay, that's fair.
It's there. And of course, David Ben Gurion, even though he was a great leader for the Israeli people, didn't he didn't quite enjoy being in office. So eventually, he retired in 1954, and was replaced with Moshe Sharet, and he only served 2 terms. In other words, 2 years. And by the way, both of these were from the party called Mapai, which is an acronym for the Land of Israel Workers Party. The acronym is, of course, in Israel in Hebrew, so that's why it doesn't quite line up. But
Yeah.
yes, Moshe Sharet, previously known as Moshe Shertuk, but changed his name to Moshe Sharet when the State of Israel was founded. He only served for 2 years, and somehow had a lot of not good notes on Wikipedia here, but most of these weren't really his fault.
Mhm.
Of course, the first in 1954 was the Scorpions Pass massacre, which was a large scale mass shooting by Palestinian. Well, they didn't call themselves Palestinians yet, but it was a mass shooting of Israelis in a bus where 12 Israelis were killed in that shooting. And then in 1954 was the Lavon affair. Really not one of Israel's bright spots. That's why in Israel it's primarily known as there really is no other way I can translate this besides just bad business, the failure or the incident.
Mhm.
Basically, what the Lavon affair was the Israeli Mossad recruited a few Jews living in Egypt to commit terror attacks against American and British targets such as schools, libraries, and movie theaters to kind of destabilize the region to persuade the British Royal Army to keep their hold over the Suez Canal.
Hmm.
Of course, it was all leading up to the Sinai War, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But yeah, it was kind of Israel knew what would have happened if the Egyptians continued to have we will have full control over the Suez Canal. Nobody really wanted that, including the British. So Israel kind of tried to nudge things in their favor. It all went south. The four agents who were involved were captured, and all four of them were executed. I think two committed suicide, and two uh, died during their torturous interrogation.
Oh
Now,
wow.
also 1954 was the Ma'agan disaster, where another perfect example of something that happened, a disaster that happened that really wasn't the prime minister's fault. Basically, it was a Piper plane that was supposed to fly a big envelope during a ceremony to celebrate the building of a monument to the fallen Jewish paratroopers who died in World War II.
Mm.
Uh, some issues with the plane, shall we say, and the plane eventually crashed into the crowd of people at the ceremony itself, the memorial ceremony, which basically became its own memorial ceremony uh, altogether. Now, it is significant because the prime minister himself, Moshe Sharet, was present in the crowd, so he almost got taken out himself. And the final note to go over on the Wikipedia is the UNU visit in 1955. You don't seem to be too excited. So
I'm
UNU
trying to
was
figure out why he looks familiar. Like I know we've talked about this, but just facially he resembles someone to me, and I'm trying to figure out who.
I don't know. We talked about him in the when we did the currency thing. He
Mhm.
was for a long time on the $20 or 20 shekel bill. Maybe that's where you recognize him from.
No, I'm just saying like he reminds me of someone else. I'm just trying to figure out who.
All
So
right.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry if it didn't seem like I was.
In any case, UNU at the time was the prime minister of Burma, which now is, of course, known as Myanmar. But he was the first foreign diplomat to visit Israel since it was founded, and kind of showed a change of perspective from a lot of other countries around the world, and showing that people can visit Israel and actually be very warmly welcome. Uh, but the he wasn't really the best prime minister, Moshe Sharett, and he kind of brought Israel a lot of problems. Therefore,
He got the boot.
no, not necessarily. This guy came back in. Like
Ah,
he realized he was needed,
the
and
man who
so
licked the socket.
what?
The man who licked a socket.
Yeah, yeah. So he realized that Israel was in a lot of trouble, so he needed to come back, and Moshe Sharett was very happy to see him take his place again,
Yep.
and being the technically third prime minister, technically also still the first. It's a weird, complicated thing. You'll actually notice that this happens quite often. That certain prime ministers in Israel got reelected several years after they were booted, but
So it's happened in American presidential history as well, and I think it might have happened in Canadian prime ministry history as well.
when did it happen in American history? Because I'm
Um,
not the biggest knowledgeable guy.
Presidents of the United States.
Are you looking it up, or are you
Actually, looking it up right now.
Okay, because in Israel it actually happened a lot. So yeah, moving over to the notes for David Ben Gurion's second term as prime minister, which of course lasted for 4 terms, because again, continuing with that rule of a term lasting only 1 year. He had the Sinai War in 1956. I think we kind of touched on it a couple of
I
times. It was a
believe
little
we
bit,
did because it does sound familiar.
yeah, it was kind of Israel, Britain, and France were kind of trying to take control of the Suez Canal from Egypt, which was really not friendly with anyone at the time.
Yeah.
1959, that was the end of the austerity period in Israel. And the final note on Ben Gurion at all tonight is the capture and trial of Adolf Eichmann.
Ooh, I know that name.
Yep, you know that name?
Oh fuck yeah!
Yep.
If you know anything about World War II, you know who Adolf Eichmann is.
Yeah. So eventually, the Mossad tracked him down. I believe he was in Argentina at the time, somewhere in Latin America. They
Yep.
dragged his ass back to Israel, tried him, and executed him. And still to this day, he remains the only person Israel has ever executed.
And with good cause.
Yeah.
Okay, so when it comes to the United States presidents, Grover Cleveland holds that distinction. He served in office from March of 1885 to March of 1889. Then Benjamin Harrison was the 23rd president from March of 89 to March of 93. And then Grover Cleveland became the 24th president from 93 to 98, 97.
And then replaced with William McKinley, right?
And then replaced with McKinley.
I know some stuff.
Yay.
So yeah, guess it does happen in American politics.
Yeah, and I'm just going to double check it because I think it might have happened in Canada as well.
Okay, but if we're not careful, this might actually happen again this year, where a president who was not who was deposed will be elected again, and let's pray that that doesn't happen. But anyways, back to the Middle East, back to Israeli politics. After Ben Gurion's second and final time in office, we move over to the man who first changed the name of Ben Gurion's party, Mapai, to shit. What what's let me just uh was the first person he was the first person to change the mapai to the array, or rather the first array and then the second array for some reason, and then they properly changed the name to the Labor Party,
Mm.
Avodah, the Israeli Labor Party, and that man, of course, was Prime Minister Levi Eshkol.
Um, Actually, before you go, so yes, I was right. Canada has had it as well, but it was like you guys right off the fucking bat. Our first prime minister was John A. Macdonald, who then was preceded by Alexander Mackenzie, who was preceded once again by John A. Macdonald.
Hey,
Literally right off the freaking bat. And then it happened again with
oh,
William Lyon Mackenzie King, who was preceded by Arthur Meighen, who was once again preceded by William Lyon Mackenzie King. And then and then who was preceded by R.B. Bennett, who was preceded by William Lyon Mackenzie King. So fucking wow,
fucking ping pong
pretty
game.
much.
Yeah,
And Pierre Trudeau, father we talked about last episode, and father of current prime minister, did it as well. So it's what, three times?
more
Yeah,
or less the
three
same.
times
The
it's
same over
happened.
here.
Well,
Yeah, more or less.
three instances of when it happened.
I think that's about the same as here. Maybe four
Hmm.
here. But in the meantime, let's get back to talking about Levi
All right.
Eshkol, who of course served as a prime minister from 1964 all the way to 1969. Nice. And in 1964, he started the National Water Carrier, which basically it was a project long in the making, but that was the beginnings of that. Basically, it's a system, a network of pipes that uh, is meant to redirect some water from the Sea of Galilee, which is in the north, to the south, because once again, very poor country, very lack of infrastructure and everything. All the water in Israel up until a certain point came from the Sea of Galilee, but for the most part, it only reached the north and some parts of the center. So the national water carrier essentially carried it all throughout the entire country, and it actually became a very point of contention in one of the later points that we'll be talking about with this prime minister. But yeah, in 1966 was the complete cancellation and removal of the military curfew, military control over the Arab Israelis. We talked about this in the previous episode. We talked about the Arab Israelis, where for the first couple of years they were governed by the military. This guy removed it, ended it. Israeli citizens in Israel, Arab citizens in Israel, pretty much for the most part got more free rights and more liberation. Now, in 1967 was the stuttering speech. Well, what comes to mind when you hear something like this?
The King's speech.
Oh, elaborate, because
So
you know
King Edward, I believe it was King Edward, Principal Queen Elizabeth's father. Um, he had a speech impediment. Basically, he had a speech disability, and then the movie The King's Speech dramatized it, where he basically took he took language lessons, not elocution lessons, and basically learned to overcome his stutter so he could talk in public.
do you think something similar to that happened in this case?
Well, basically, based on you asking me the name of it, I would assume so.
Well, I can guarantee you that's what I thought, and then I looked into it. It's really nothing that big. Okay, so there was growing military presence in Egypt in the Sinai Peninsula, leading to a possible potential war. There was very civil unrest in all over Israel. People were really afraid that there was another war coming. So this guy basically had to give a speech in front of the whole country to kind of uh, uh, dispel any rumors of that, and basically calm people down. And of course, as per usual, speeches were pre-prepared, pre-made for him, and he was supposed to pre-record it in his office and then transmit it on the radio. Didn't have time for it because Prime Minister, he was very busy, a lot of
Yeah.
meetings that day. So it was eventually then decided that representatives from the radio station would meet him. Can't remember exactly where, but they were going to meet with him, and he was going to read out that speech live
Mhm.
on public radio. And the person who wrote the speech then he wrote it on a typewriter and then moved it over to a guy who was supposed to go over the speech, make sure everything is in order, and check and doing any spell checks, any grammar checks, all that stuff. And that person decided to change one word because he felt like it would have helped the speech flow a little bit better, but he changed it in his own handwriting. And because the prime minister did not pre-read the speech before
Mm.
doing it live, he kind of had problems recognizing what that word actually meant. And on live radio, asked one of his handlers and one of his consultants to look over the speech, and what followed was a series of murmurs that then resulted in one of the technicians switching his microphone off, and then a couple minutes later switching it back on so they can continue the speech and finish it properly. Ultimately, it was nothing.
Well,
Nothing too big.
no, it's more of an incident than anything else.
Yes.
But I bet you that guy who changed the word was fired.
I don't know about that, but you can imagine the responses people made. I mean, the media had a field day. His opposition was having a festival, talking about this guy stuttering and breaking live on radio. One simple mistake is all it takes, apparently.
Just once.
Yep. Thankfully for this guy's reputation, 1 week later, the 6-Day War started. And again, 1967, which of course he was the prime minister that led Israel to a massive victory in just 6 days against 5 invading Arab armies. So
there you go.
I can tell you that
so much for stuttering.
Yeah, so much for being a weak leader.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, though, in 1969, he died of a heart attack.
Bummer.
Like he had 2 heart attacks in the span of a couple of days, and the second one killed him. And following that, he of course Israel needed a prime minister, so they kind of gave the position of prime minister to his second in command at the time, Yigal Allon, who was actively the prime minister for about 20 days. Which, oddly enough, that doesn't seem long to you. That was about as long as the Yom Kippur War. But sadly, nothing too interesting happened in those 20 days for this guy. So there really aren't any notes for this guy. There needed a lot of interesting stuff, like the Allon plan, which was one of the plans that would, if implemented properly, could have led to a peace between Israelis and Palestinians. And yes, by this point in history, they were calling themselves Palestinians now. But since that plan has never been properly implemented, we're still living in the shithole shithole of a state. Shithole of a situation that we are in today. Now, of course, before Levi Eshkol passed away from a heart attack, he more or less set the stage for who his eventual successor in the Array party would be, or rather the Labor Party, who his successor would be, which of course eventually ended up getting elected properly, and she was Golda Meir, which we talked about enough times. Of course, there are several things we need to mention here because she's got plenty of notes. 1969, of course, was the War of Attrition, which was a war between Israel and Egypt, which kind of lasted for about 3 years. In 1969, also was the beginning of the mass migration from the USSR, which uh, was around 150,000 Jews in that year, and around 100,000 more Jews migrated to other countries that were still not part of the Soviet Union. In 1972 was the Black Panther protests.
Or like as in the same Black Panthers that we had over here.
In name only.
Okay.
Yeah, but pretty much similar things. The only major exception was it was a protest primarily propagated by the Sephardic Jews, uh, the Jews that migrated from northern African countries and other Arab or Muslim countries to Israel, who were basically getting the same treatment as you can imagine from the name Black Panthers.
Gotcha.
Now, obviously, as we also discussed in previous episodes, in 1972 was the Munich massacre of the 11 uh, athletes in the Olympics, which of course then started Operation Wrath of God, an operation that lasted several years, in fact, several decades, of hunting down and taking out every single one of the Palestinian terrorists who were involved with that massacre. It took years, but eventually we got them.
That name is a little on the nose.
Yeah,
Wrath of
well,
God.
dude, trust me, we're gonna talk a lot about a lot of other operations.
Yeah.
You're
You want
gonna
to
notice.
hear
You're
about
gonna
our
notice
plan?
the trend.
No, I think the title is good enough.
No, you're gonna notice a bit of a trend. This one actually seems a bit tame compared to some of the other operations we're going to talk about today.
All right.
But yes, so the point still stands. It took us time, but we still got to all of them. Same thing is going to happen to Yahya Sinwar and Muhammad Def, inshallah. Anyway, so in 1973 was Operation Spring of Youth, which was an IDF raid into Lebanon in response to a series of attacks, and of course in 1973 also was the Yom Kippur War. In 1974 was the a big Palestinian terror attack in the Israeli city of Kiryat Shmona, which sadly yesterday another person was killed from another missile from Lebanon. May he rest in peace. But yeah, so the Kiryat Shmona massacre was a terror attack perpetrated by terrorists from Lebanon in April 11, 1974, where 18 Israelis, 16 civilians, and 2 soldiers were killed. And of course, the Lebanese terrorists then blew themselves up because, of course, that's what they do
Yep.
after the thing. And also 1974 was the Ma'alot massacre, which was this time it was a Palestinian terror attack because there have been a lot of these, and eventually the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War was too great for her, so eventually she stepped down. Now, of course, this is a bit of
I believe that.
yeah. Now, this is actually a bit of a turning point because uh, this is where we see a bit of a change from the one term is every year to every 4 years, where she served. She was a prime minister from 1969 all the way up to 1974. Of course, the 1979 kind of started with the 1 year rule, but then after her second term began, it kind of changed to the 4 year rule, or 4 or 5 year rule, which is why she eventually stepped down in 1974. And in 1974, she was replaced, still the same Labor Party, but she was replaced by Yitzhak Rabin. And trust me, we are going to talk a lot about him today, but in his first term, which lasted from 74 all the way to 77, was in 1974 the Ben Shahar committee, which was a public committee to help create a reform in the tax system in Israel. In 1975 was an interim uh, agreement between Israel and Egypt, which eventually would lead to a peace treaty with Egypt several years down the line. And in 1976 was Operation Entebbe, which we made an entire episode of.
Mhm.
And in 1977, of course, Rabin stepped down and was after, oh wow, almost 30 full years of being an entirely led by the leftist side of Israeli politics. This was the first victory for the right wing side in Israeli politics. The victory of the Likud party, led by Menachem Begin. In other words, begging you. You're not
He's
familiar with the
got
song?
very thick glasses.
Oh yeah, I mean it was the time. It was
Oh
it
yeah,
was
yeah.
it was definitely the time.
Hey, he's
So you
wearing
know
bifocals.
what?
He's wearing bifocals.
Yeah. How could you tell from this distance?
There's a line right in the middle of his one on the what would be his left glass.
Oh, are you on full screen?
Oh yeah.
'Cause I wasn't for a second. I didn't see that. But yeah, so he was in office from 1977 all the way up to 1983, and some of his major achievements, it was the eventual peace treaty with Egypt in 1979, which of course resulted in Israel giving back the Sinai Peninsula that it conquered and annexed in the Six Day War. In 1979 was the financial revolution, which it was intended as a good thing, but eventually it led Israel down a very bad road financially, and really helped uh, grow the inflation in Israel, which took a few years to recover, but eventually we did.
Yeah, we're going through that right now.
In 1981 was the bombing of the nuclear reactor in Iraq, which for a time was a very legitimate threat to Israel until eventually Israel bombed it with the Israeli Air Force, and is no longer bothering us anymore today. If only we can do the same to another nuclear reactor that's bothering us at the moment. But yeah, also 1981 was the Golan Heights Law, which basically gave Israel. It was a controversial move, not really liked by other countries around the world, as is the case with pretty much everything Israel does. But it basically gave Israel full control and autonomy over the Golan Heights, which it conquered and annexed following the Six Day War. Still to this day, it is still technically considered part of Israel, and only in the early 2000s did the United States finally recognized and acknowledged Israel's sovereignty in that region. Can't say the same about any other country besides Israel, but that's neither here nor there. And of course, in 1982 was the first Lebanon War, which started as the peace peace in Galilee operation, which basically not only just saw Israel starting a full-on war with Lebanon and, more importantly, the terrorist organization Hezbollah, but basically it kind of started a period of the IDF essentially controlling parts of Lebanon, or rather southern Lebanon, which is the northern of Israel. We'll get back to that later, but at some point this was more or less the time when
Yeah.
Begin started regretting some choices, and of course he left and he was replaced with the next prime minister and the leader of the Likud party, Yitzhak Shamir. Uh, didn't really do much. I mean, he only served for about a year to kind of finish out what was supposed to be Begin's final term.
He
And
definitely looks like an old Jewish man.
oh yeah, absolutely. So does the next guy. We're
Oh,
going
and
to
then
talk.
the missing is the fucking hat, like the fucking pork pie hat.
Yeah, but Yeah, and like I said, so is the next guy we're going to talk about. But the only major thing that Wikipedia thought was worthy to mention in that year was the second tier um, disaster. Where basically, it's a bit of a complicated thing, but in Lebanon, in a place called Tyre, this a thanks to a suicide bombing attack, the a building which was used by the IDF as a command center collapsed and killed about 91 people, uh, most of whom were IDF soldiers, and the other half were Le- um, Lebanese prisoners. But this was the first one in 1982. This was the second one in 1983, which at this point led to the death of 59 dead. Where at this point, where the vast majority were the Lebanese detainees. So yeah, the first one kind of happened in '82 during Begin's rule, but this one was in Shamir's rule in 1983. It was one of the main uh, hints that Israel needs to leave Lebanon, but we'll talk more about that later because following this, in 1984, Shamir stepped down, or rather, was replaced in the elections, where the balance of power once again returned to the Labour Party, which was at that point led by one Mister Shimon Peres. Yeah, you can really tell that he had a very significant voice and a very significant accent.
I
To it.
I believe it. He
Yep.
definitely looks like a stuffy old man.
Oh yes, but you know what? He was a very towards his later years, he was actually more of a kind grandfather figure, but not so much in his early years. I would I would also like to tell you he was basically one of the main masterminds behind the Entebbe operation.
Hmm.
He actually suggested it to Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin at the time. I'm now going to move away from this action. Thank you
Yeah.
very much. So yeah, he was in office between 84 and 86, and during that time was in 1984 Operation Moses, which I think we talked about. This was bringing bringing the 6,364 Ethiopian Jews to Israel, and also in 85 was the beginning of the financial stabilization or stability program, which helped fix a lot of the problems of the previous two prime ministers. In 1985 was the Jibril prisoner exchange. It was a prisoner exchange between Israel to and between Israel and the Populist Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which we talked about them in the Operation Entebbe episode, where basically Israel exchanged Palestinian prisoners in exchange for Israeli soldiers. Now, do you want to know how many prisoners did Israel release in return for their soldiers in this deal, in the Jibril?
Probably significantly more.
Absolutely, but can you want to give me a number?
I'll say north of 100.
Say what?
North of 100.
Well, you're right about that.
Okay, so we'll go with 117.
Okay, that's cool. So, are you sitting comfortably for this?
Very.
And during this deal, Israel, you probably should not be drinking while I'm saying this.
Go ahead.
Is Israel released 1,151 Palestinian prisoners?
Wow. And how many went back the other way?
Guess.
12.
Okay, close.
Higher or lower?
I'm just saying close. Do you want? Do you
Yeah,
want to
of
know the full
course.
number?
Yeah.
3.
Wow. I almost said 2 originally. Wow.
We're a lot closer.
Holy shit.
Yeah, 1,151 Palestinian prisoners for 3 Israeli soldiers. Because
Jeez.
that's the Palestinians for you. They always want more and
Yep.
more and more, no matter how much you give them. And in 1985 was Operation Wooden Leg. I kid you not, that was the name of the operation. It was an
That is Long John Silver.
nope. It was the still to this day the longest. Sorry, the furthest that the Israeli Air Force has ever operated. It was a bombing of the Fatah, which is the essentially the leaders of the Palestinian Liberation Movement. It was bombing of the Fatah offices in Tunisia,
Oh
of
wow!
all places. Yeah, we went that far.
You guys fucking went to Tatooine. Holy shit!
Pretty much. Yeah, yeah, Tatooine, exactly. And following the reign of Shimon Peres,
Brr.
we now in 1986 go right back to the Likud party and the return of Yitzhak Shamir.
This guy.
Yep, this guy. We went on for a bit longer than last time, from 1986 all the way up to 1992.
Oh,
And during that time, several interesting things happened, like the first Intifada, which we talked about already. And during the 90s was another mass migration from the former USSR, which, yeah, but by the year 2000 was around, from the beginning of the 90s all the way up to 2000 was around 1 million migrants from the former USSR to Israel.
holy
And
shit!
the presence is still very much felt today, very
That's
dominant. And speaking of migration, in 1991 was Operation Solomon, which we also talked about in the previous episode, which brought in 36 hours brought 14,310 Ethiopian Jews to Israel. In 1991 was the Madrid Committee, which was another international committee to try and improve relations between Israel and the Palestinians, as well as the other um, uh, Arab nations in the area, hopefully leading towards a peace between Israelis and Palestinians, which of course, if you know your history, never happened, because the Palestinians have a bit of a history of saying no whenever they're being offered anything, except more operations and more terrorism. But the one good thing that came from this committee was the beginnings of improving relations between Israel and another one of its close neighbors, Jordan. And also in 1991 was, of course, the Gulf War.
Oh yes, the famous Gulf War.
Now, I don't think I need to explain that to you. Now, officially, technically, Israel didn't participate in the Gulf War, but it did take a couple of hits because the Iraqis fired missiles into Saudi Arabia and Israel.
That's one of the first wars that I became aware of, just because I was born in 1987. So yeah, I would have definitely have heard of the Gulf War, and I became more aware of that before I started learning about World War II and stuff like that.
Yeah. Oh wow, really? That's interesting.
Yeah, no, this would have probably been the first one that I would have known.
Cool. Now again, just to reiterate,
Actually, I know someone who served in the Gulf War. He used to work for
what?
them.
Oh, really? Cool. Of course, as I mentioned, the Israel didn't really take part in it, but they still took a couple missiles because, if you got an opportunity to shoot something at Israel, you take it. That's the way things go in the Middle East.
Israel means target.
Yep, absolutely. The Star of David is just a massive target.
Pretty much. Basically, all the points are saying hit here, 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 here.
Yeah. All roads lead to Israel, and all missiles lead to Israel eventually. Now, in 1992, where there was another election, and this was now the return of the Labour Party, and once again the return of Yitzhak Rabin. I did say we're going to talk about him again.
You did, but I didn't realize he'd really grow old.
Yeah. I mean, that's what happens to people, apparently.
Well, I didn't realize it would be like I mean, never mind.
He was, let me just check. He must have been, he was in his 70s
Yeah, I
when
believe
he
that.
was reelected. Yeah, this is what he looked like 20 years earlier, and this is what he looked like in the later years of his term. Of course, he could be an.
well, actually, for a politician.
What?
He aged
Oh,
well
yeah.
for a politician.
So is another one we will be eventually begrudgingly talking about. But yeah, so his contributions to Israel are far and wide. He could literally have his own episode. In fact, he almost, if October 7th didn't happen, he would have had his own episode. But then
Oh.
certain things took precedent around the time an episode like that would have taken place.
Yep.
But let's talk about some of the achievements he had in this specific term from 92 to 1995. In 1993 were the Oslo Accords. Have you at least
Yep.
heard of the Oslo
Yes,
Accords?
I have.
Yeah, they were basically the start of what would have been the closest ever we've ever gotten to a peace between Israel and Palestine, or the Palestinian Authority to be more specific. And in 1994, however, was the peace deal, the peace treaty with Jordan, the one that kind of started to come to fruition in the Madrid Committee. So yeah, this guy did a lot of moves to help promote peace in the Middle East between Israel and its Arab neighbors and Arab citizens. So yeah, naturally you would assume that he was actually very, very well liked. He was very popular, right?
I would imagine, but probably not.
Yeah, because in 1995 he was assassinated.
No.
Yep. Now, who do you think would want to kill a prime minister like that?
Right. The other guys,
Be more specific.
Palestinians.
See, that's where you're wrong. He was actually killed.
I didn't want to say it for the mistake of sounding like an asshole.
No, see, he was actually killed by a Jewish religious radical named Yigal Amir.
Sorry, what's his name again?
Yigal Amir. A firm Jewish radical, part of a very own Israeli terrorist group, as a matter of fact, who actually thought he did the right thing by taking this guy out, and he's still in prison, still to this day.
Good.
Yeah, and of course there are some people who worship him as savior. It's a whole thing. Israeli politics is weird.
I get it.
But-
Remember, I'm living in the era of Trump.
Oh yes, so yeah, and we do have our own version of Trump that's coming up in just a minute.
Yeah.
But you know, in November the 4th, 1995, when he was assassinated, he was almost immediately replaced by his second in command. Can you guess who that was?
Benjamin Netanyahu.
Not even fucking close.
Sorry.
Shimon Peres.
Oh, he's back.
Yep,
I guess you did say that there was a lot of this. Yeah.
I did say, and he
Yeah.
actually got properly reelected again a couple of weeks later when they did re-elections, and he actually got reinstated properly for another term that lasted for all 7 or 8 months of a full thing. But during that time, he actually managed to do a lot. In 1995, he spearheaded the legal revolution, legal reform, which essentially, for the most part, helped to instate 2 new base laws in the Israeli constitution for an individual's dignity and liberty, and for freedom of profession. Let's put it that way.
So,
And what?
so I'm sorry. Keep going. I'll ask afterwards.
In 1996 was Operation Grapes of Rage or Grapes of Wrath. Let me just be absolutely sure.
That's a novel and movie.
Yeah, Grapes of Wrath. That was the name of the operation. It was
just some might as well name it after a classic, I guess.
it's named after a novel, I believe.
Yeah, the novel, which was turned into the famous movie with Henry Fonda.
Yeah, but okay, so the name of the novel by John Steinbeck.
Yep, John Steinbeck, who also wrote John Steinbeck, very prolific American author.
I did say some of these were gonna be completely on the nose, but yeah, this was another Israeli operation by the IDF in Lebanon, which lasted about 17 days, which still all part of Israel still staying in the southern area of Lebanon, and it also in 1996 was the assassination, or rather elimination, of Yahya Ayash. Yahya Ayash. Bit hard to pronounce in English, but yeah, he was
think?
a
I don't have enough phlegm.
yeah. But yeah, so he was a top Hamas leader and actually one of the founding members of the Hamas's military wing, Izzeddin al-Qassam.
Which I say, fuck you.
Yeah, fuck this guy.
Okay, so now my question: why did he only last 8 months or whatever it was?
That was when, if Rabin would have still been prime minister, that would have been where his term would have ended.
Oh, so he just felt gotcha. So he just
Yeah,
said
all the way to the end. Yeah.
I hear you.
And then and now we finally get to where I actually can actually remember this being talked about. Actually, can remember politics, and actually can remember some of the prime ministers in Israel when in 1996, when I was 3 or 4. No, sorry. After that, but yeah, I actually started knowing about Israeli politics and prime ministers when I was 5
Yeesh.
in the late 90s. That's how early we start politics this side of the world, apparently.
Yeah, well, because for you guys, it's practically life and death.
Pretty much, yeah.
Where over here, it's not. So,
It's meh.
well, it's not meh. It's just why burden with like what. I understand why it is the way it is over there, but like us, it's like, well, we don't need to introduce our kids to that at young of an age because, like I said, it's not life or death.
Yeah.
That's something you learn later on, or if you choose to learn it, right? But,
I literally had that introduced to me in kindergarten when I was 5.
yeah, and like I said, it's more understandable because for you, it's literally you life or death, like I said.
And can you guess which was the first prime minister I've heard the name of?
The only one whose name I know on a regular basis is Netanyahu, but I'm probably way off again.
You're actually bang on.
That's not Netanyahu.
That is it. That is what he looked like in 1996 when he got elected.
No.
Yep.
Jesus. What the hell happened?
Politics, man. It changes you. So
yeah, did you look at Obama before and after he left office?
Not just before and after. I mean, Obama when he got elected and 6 months later.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. So he was elected in 1996 and lasted all the way to 1999. And of course, it goes without saying, but he was still part of the Likud party. And in 1996, he kind of was He was kind of responsible for the Temple Mount riots, where there are, of course, these tunnels running underneath the Temple Mount and the Western Wall. The kind of lead from the Jewish side of Jerusalem all the way to the Muslim side of Israel, of Jerusalem. And this guy decided it would be a good idea to open them up for tourists around Yom Kippur. And you can imagine that the Palestinian leader at the time, Yasser Arafat, was not a big fan of that.
I know who that is.
Yeah. So
he kind of ordered all the comedians.
Yeah. He ordered multiple men to go out attacking the people in Israel who were crossing. It was kind of a bloodbath, but yeah, not a very good start to Prime Minister. And knowing this guy, it only got worse from there. Now, 1996, though, was the Hebron Agreement, where sort of the kind of managed to split the region of Hebron in the West Bank in half, kind of give some of it to the Palestinians, some of it to still be in control of Israel. One of the factors that was still left over from the Oslo Accords to kind of help promote peace between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, which of course, eventually went by the wayside in the early 2000s. But then in 1997 was the helicopter disaster. Now, again, just like the Magan disaster, not really Netanyahu's fault, and it's a rarity that's really
Yes.
one of Netanyahu's. It's not really Netanyahu's thing, but basically, it was still during the operation between Israel in southern Lebanon, where on their way to a military operation, two helicopters bumped into each other and then crashed in a resort at the north of Israel.
Mhm.
And let me just make sure that I'm getting the numbers correctly. It's not written over here, so I'm just gonna have to open it at a new tab. The 37 was the number of deaths in the helicopter disaster,
Yeesh.
and in 1998 was the VI or the Y W. Let me just make sure I'm spelling this correctly. The WYE river memorandum, which basically it's another one of those parts of the Oslo Accords. In fact, one of the final ones to actually implement the Oslo Accords. But if you know your history, I don't think I need to remind you, didn't really happen because
Yeah.
Palestinians have a bit of a weird obsession with saying no to stuff. They say yes until you actually need to sign things. But yeah, so in 1999, that was the end of Netanyahu's first reign, and he was replaced by Mr. Ehud Barak, which is the first time I actually can properly remember an election happening.
Mhm.
Lasted from 1999 to 2000, weirdly enough. And
Only a year.
yep, 2 years.
You said 99 to 2000?
2001, sorry, my bad. Sorry,
I mean,
it's late.
second half.
Yeah, and his probably his most notable decision was the withdrawal of the IDF from southern Lebanon in 2000. That was essentially the end of what was known as the First Lebanon War, and as you can imagine, things only got worse from there.
Yeah.
In 2000 was the Camp David summit, which again was one of the last few steps needed to reach peace between Israelis and Palestinians. But of course, that was also stalled because also in 2000 was the beginning of the second Intifada, which we also talked about in a previous
Mhm.
episode. And then, of course, he was deposed and replaced by the return of the Likud party. Now, can you tell me who the leader of the Likud party was at the time?
Since I know he comes back, we'll go with Netanyahu again.
Well, no, it was actually Ariel Sharon.
Oh, fuck, yeah, that's right, Ariel Sharon. Motherfucker, I should have known that one.
Hey!
I should have known that one. Again, the only reason I know most of these names is because of comedians, primarily Robin Williams.
Obviously. And of course, didn't really happen because of him, but he kind of had to deal with the second Intifada from 2001 all the way to 2005. In 2002 was Operation Defensive Shield, which was mostly done against Palestinian rioters who were committing these suicide bombings on buses all throughout the Second Intifada. Also in 2002 was the beginning of building the separation wall between Israeli territories and territories in the Palestinian Authority, or West Bank, as it's mostly known around the world. And of course, here's another famous thing we talked about in 2005 was, of course, the disengagement. You remember we talked about that one, right? Yes, and of course, in early to mid 2006, he basically had a he basically went into a coma and was replaced by who was his second in command at the time, Ehud Olmert. And he was only in office for a couple of days before being properly elected in a actual official legal election on May 4th, 2006, and actually served for a full term all the way up to 2009. So yeah,
I don't know why, but I was given Rose Tyler's dad's vibes when I saw that picture.
I never noticed that until now. You just opened
Yeah.
my eyes to that.
Yeah, holy shit. I was like, whoa.
So yeah, right before Sharon went into his coma, he kind of got a lot of shit from his friends at the Likud party. So he completely split from that party altogether and founded his own party called Kadima, which literally means forward or onward, which was a little less right leaning and slightly more to the center leaning. And he actually got a lot of support for doing that. He was actually very popular. It was a very popular decision for doing that, despite the disengagement not being the most liked decision by any Israeli politician ever. And that was one of the major factors that led to Olmert being elected, because he was the leader of Kadima in Sharon's absence. Which of course Sharon himself passed away in 2014 after way too many years of being in a coma. 8 years, as a matter of fact.
Oof, that's a long time.
Very long time. And during Olmert's time as prime minister, he of course was the prime minister during the second Lebanon war between Israel and the terrorist organization Hezbollah. In 2007 was the Annapolis Committee, an Annapolis Conference in Annapolis, Maryland, which basically it was another one of those pointless committees to conferences to try and promote peace between Israelis and Palestinians that the Palestinians eventually know. As a matter of fact, Olmert actually offered the Palestinians the entirety of the West Bank and a few other territories just to sweeten the deal. More territories than they were ever being offered, and they still said no. Just lets you know how these people think. I mean, going back to the previous thing, 1,000 plus prisoners for 3 people. Yeah, these people always want more. Anyways, in 2007 was the attack on the nuclear reactor in Syria, which, just like the nuclear reactor in Iraq before it, and just like the nuclear reactor in Iran today, posed a significant threat to Israel, which Israel ended. Jury's still out on the one in Iran. But yeah, in between late 2018 and very early 2008 and very early 2009 was the Cast-Lead operation, the first major operation by Israel in Gaza following the disengagement.
Ooh.
So yeah, didn't really live up to the legacy left by his predecessor. And and in 2009, he was of course replaced in a proper election by the man himself, Benjamin Netanyahu, also known as Bibi to people who know him. And he lasted a practically legendary term from 2009 all the way to 2021. Yes, that's how long this guy's been in office, and that's after he was already elected back in the 90s.
And I was going to say, he's still in office, though.
Pretty much, yeah. And here are some of the significant stuff that he managed to
Fuck up. I'm sorry.
fuck up. Yeah, exactly. In 2011 was the social justice protests, which basically, after a very long time, especially under Netanyahu's reign, where things just became a lot more expensive, a lot pricier. I remember there was a protest regarding cottage cheese, then the bread, and then the cost of living, then the cost of apartments and houses, to the point where hundreds of thousands of people were protesting all over the streets. You could literally could not go anywhere without seeing one of these protests happening at any given moment. In fact, because the cost of living was so damn high and so insufferable, people literally started setting up these mini cities inside cities, tent cities, Hooverville style, like literally Hooverville style, People started living in tents in central parks in Israel, in almost every major city in the country.
Oh wow.
Yeah, and this went on for months, and well, it kind of started to die down after the Gilad Shalit deal, which also took place in 2011. We already talked about this one. I mean, yeah, 1,027 prisoners for one guy. That's the one.
Wow.
And this protest, I mean, it had some moments. I mean, it brought some new players into the public consciousness, but then they also somehow became members of the Knesset themselves and became politicians themselves and kind of faded into obscurity since then. So, you don't really hear too much about them anymore. But then the riots and the protests completely died down in 2012 with the Pillar of Defense operation in Gaza, and then 2 years later, followed by the Steadfast Edge operation in Gaza, the one I actually took active part in. In 2017, the United States officially recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and moved the United States Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And you can kind of guess which American president was responsible for that, based on the times. And between 2019 and 2022 was a great political crisis in Israel, which resulted in no less than 5 elections in a span of just 3 years.
Holy shit.
I mean, I still remember that. Like every 3 or 4 months, there was another election. And Netanyahu gets reelected. No one wants to sit with him in government. He can't properly form a coalition. Government breaks down. New election. Netanyahu gets voted again. And once again, no one wants to sit with him. Can't make a coalition. Breaks down. Elections again. At
some point they'd figure maybe he's the problem.
He'll never admit it. Obviously. He never will. But yeah. And also, this happened. Get this. This happened during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yep, I remember.
Between 2020 and 2021. Now, of course, this, again, completely out of Netanyahu's control. What was he going to do? But, this also didn't really help his case.
Yeah.
But, Israel was one of the countries that really did not prepare themselves properly for this thing, but it was actually one of the first few countries that actually got a handle on it. And for a time, they were actually one of the first few countries that actually got out of this crisis. So there's that. In 2020 was the beginning of the Abraham Accord, which was the start of a process normalizing relations between Israel and all the other Arab nations in the region, which kind of started a bit of a peace process between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Morocco as well, and even certain countries like Saudi Arabia. They were almost on the brink of signing a legendary historic deal between Israel, the United States, and Saudi Arabia, which was, of course, stopped by something we both know what it was and is going to come up eventually on this list. Now, in 2021 was the Mount Meron disaster, which basically it was during Lag BaOmer, which was another holiday we discussed already, where thousands of Israeli Haredic Jews went up to Mount Meron to celebrate at the burial place of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in celebration of Lag BaOmer, and basically the whole stage area collapsed and people essentially got crushed and smashed to death and suffocated. It is still considered till this day the largest civil disaster in the history of the state of Israel.
Oh, shit.
45 men and children were killed and about 102 injured. And the official inquiry committee, which only gave the results earlier this month, found this guy as one of the major people responsible for the disaster.
Not
So
surprised.
yeah, and also in 2021 was the Guardian Walls operation, another operation between Israel and Gaza, which was another one of those big controversial things where the whole world turned on us. But yeah, so and there's another thing that I want to put on this list that apparently Wikipedia didn't think was important enough, but it was also the Mount Carmel forest fire, which we also
Right,
talked
which we
about a couple of
discussed,
episodes
yes.
ago. So yeah, Netanyahu is not only responsible for the biggest disaster to fall on the Jewish people since the Holocaust with October 7th, which we're not even talking about in this term, but yeah, he's also responsible for the biggest civil disaster in Israel's history with the Mount Meron uh, incident, and the biggest natural disaster, which is of course the Mount Carmel forest fire. Is anyone getting the message? Am I getting through to anyone watching this?
Yeah, well, he's the one that needs to get it.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, he'll never admit it. But yeah, after the wild media circus of the elections that happened in the late 2010s and early 2020s, eventually was finally brought down, not through legal elections, but because he had multiple charges against him.
Yeah.
Charges that didn't stick, unfortunately. But going into that, it was a very complicated elections, and somehow two completely different leaders from two completely opposite sides of the political spectrum, and namely these two guys, Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid. Naftali Bennett was a representative of the right. Yair Lapid was and still is a representative of the left. They sort of went into a united front, a unity government against Netanyahu, and they only were able to win because Netanyahu was taken down because of his allegations, and they both won. Yair Lapid took the majority of the votes, and said enough, and they kind of decided to have to take this term in turns. That one would be the prime minister for a time, and then the other one would replace him. And Yair Lapid, of course, took the majority of the votes. And because Israel was facing so many different crises at the same time, he basically turned to his colleague Naftali Bennett and told him, "You know what? You're better equipped to deal with these things. You take the first half of the term, even though I have the larger party.
Yeah.
You lead the country, and I'll come in and back you up when your turn to run this thing is over." Naftali Bennett, of course, himself was prime minister for about a year between 2021 and 2022, and Yair Lapid was the prime minister for since July 2022 to December of 2022. Yeah, he actually got the short end of the stick by choice. And from 2021 to 2022, of course, was the continuation of the political crisis and the COVID-19 virus, and of course was the in 2022 another wave of terror in Israel by Palestinian terrorists, and Operation Breaking Waves, which another operation in the West Bank by the IDF, and then of course that was the end of Naftali Bennett's time in office, and the start of Yair Lapid, which of course continued a political crisis, and the continuation of Operation Breaking Waves. Then in 2022 also was Operation Rising Dawn, which was a 3-day operation by the IDF against top members of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And in late 2022, later in Yair Lapid's reign, was the naval agreement on the naval border agreement between Israel and Lebanon. There's some minor stuff happening there with Israel and Lebanon finding large portions of natural gases and natural oil in the water, and they sort of kind of split the whole thing not so evenly. But we don't even need to get into that because nothing really much came from that. And on the end of 2029, on December, near December, we had another wave of elections, and can you guess who won that?
Yeah.
Yes, because apparently every time this guy runs, he just wins for some reason. And oh boy, this is by far easily the worst government in the history of Israel. In 2023 alone, we had the judicial reform, which basically was when Netanyahu and his friends essentially decided to screw everything up and turn Israel from a democracy to a dictatorship, and which also was followed by a large wave of terror in all 2023, which of course then resulted in Operation Shield and Arrow, which is a operation exclusively between the IDF and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And Hamas was very quiet during that whole thing, didn't do a single thing. People were actually starting to believe that Hamas didn't want war anymore, didn't want to fight anymore. And then, of course, the October 7th massacre happened, which led to the current war, which is so far nicknamed Swords of Iron. So yeah, all these names of operations don't mean shit because they keep on happening, and that I did not believe we were actually going to spend pretty much the entire episode just talking about that. I have a full list of two lists of other stuff to talk about, but yeah.
Not today.
While we recover from that, what could be your possible summary from all these?
You guys like to have a lot of operations, man.
I mean, not by choice.
No, definitely not by choice. No, you guys, 75 years is not really a long time, but you guys have certainly had a lot of things go on, and by a lot of dummies.
A lot of bad decisions.
Yeah.
Anywho, since I uploaded all these pictures, might as well talk about them. So now we're going to just exclusively talk about the presidents. There were a lot more of them than there were prime ministers, but we're not really going to have much notes to talk about any of these. So let's just bring them up because they're going to come up in that other topic that I mentioned earlier. So yeah, we've got the first president was Chaim Weizmann, and we're not really going to get into that. But for a bit, he was actually deposed and replaced by Yosef Springzak before getting a proper president for a full term in Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, and for some reason again replaced for a acting president for a short time, Kadish Luz, and then now we get a series of proper presidents serving a proper full term, like Zalman Shazar, followed by Ephraim Katzir, followed by Yitzhak Navon, then followed by Chaim Herzog, and then of course followed by Ezer Weizmann, which again for some unknown reason deposed and had a acting president, not a proper president, Avram Burg, sorry. And then now we actually get into the presidents that I actually properly remember for not necessarily all the right reasons. Moshe Katsav, less said about him the better. Can you guess why?
He did some horrible shit.
The guy was a serial rapist.
Next.
Yep, next. And yeah, it's going to come up in that other topic, but he was for a short time replaced by the first ever female president of Israel, Dalia Itzik, which didn't really last long before she was properly replaced with a full-on president, which lasted 7 years, from 2007 all the way to 2014. Can you guess who that man was?
I want to say what's his nuts again, even though I know I'm wrong.
Say it.
Netanyahu.
No.
Of course
Because he can't be prime minister and president at the same time.
Well, he can't keep winning all the time either, and it still happens. So
yeah, well, wibbly wobbly. Shimon Peres.
Oh, I did not know that.
Yeah, he was actually a much better president than he was prime minister. Replaced by a former chairman of the Knesset, Reuven Rivlin, and now we get to the current president of Israel, Yitzhak Herzog, the son of Chaim Herzog.
Oh,
Yeah, and he is currently the current president of Israel, despite not being belonging to any party for some reason. He was for a very long time part of the Labour Party, and for a bit was actually one of the few people who were posed to defeat Netanyahu. He even tied with him and actually surpassed him in the polls. And then somehow the Netanyahu magic worked, and he didn't become prime minister. And yes, that's basically how he talks.
okay.
And now that we're done with that, let's talk about General Chiefs of Staff. And minor notes, just the some of the operations that they were a part of. The first General Chief of Staff was, of course, Yaakov Dori, who was present for the foundation of the IDF and the Israeli War of Independence, but he was kind of sick. Didn't really do much at the time, so he was almost immediately replaced by Yigal Yadin, who kind of finished out the Israeli War of Independence. He was then replaced by Mordecai Maklef, who was part of the Padion incidents with the again another Palestinian related terror organization or terror group, which and then of course he also was part of the reprisal operations back in the day. And he was then replaced. And by the way, General Chief of Staff is just for 4 years, and then you're done. You don't get a second term, unless extenuating circumstances, and you can't get re-chosen as the General Chief of Staff. Just wanted to point that out. And the next General Chief of Staff was someone who would in later years become the Minister of Defense, Moshe Dayan, which we also talked about in Yom Kippur War. He also still took part of the reprisals operations, and he was part of the Sinai War. He led the Sinai War. Then he was replaced by Chaim Laskov, followed by Tzvi Tzur. Nothing too significant to happen during their times, but for the time of the 6-Day War, the General Chief of Staff was one Mr. Yitzhak Rabin.
Name definitely rings a bell.
What?
Name rings a bell.
He was the guy that was assassinated.
Yes, that's right. It definitely rings a bell. So now I'm looking at him in his uniform. So
now you've seen him in 3 completely different phases in his life,
which is why it threw me off.
Yep. Next on for the War of Attrition was Chaim Bar-Lev, and for the Yom Kippur War was David Elazar, also nicknamed Dado. For Operation Jonathan and Operation Litani was the General Chief of Staff Mordechai Gur, or Mota Gur, as he's commonly referred. Some of these General Chief of Staff just have these weird nicknames, such as the next one, Rafael Eitan, or Rafi Eitan, or as he's more commonly known, Raful. He was mainly in charge of the withdrawal from Sinai, the First Lebanon War, and Operation Ofra. Then he was replaced by Moshe Levi, which is the first color picture we get. So there's that. He was in charge of the Wooden Leg operation, the Line 300 incident, and the security belt in Lebanon. And then he was replaced by Dan Shomron, who was still part of the security belt in Lebanon. He was still a General Chief of Staff during the Gulf War and the First Intifada. He was then replaced by another familiar face, Ehud Barak, who was, of course, the Prime Minister back in the early 2000s. He was still part of the he was still there for the security belt in Lebanon and Operation. How do I even translate this? Let me just do Wikipedia do it for me. Operation Accountability. Yeah, that's one way of translating that.
Okay,
He was what?
said okay then.
He was replaced by Amnon Lipkin Shahak, was still part of the security belt. He was involved in the Grapes of Rage, the Grapes of Wrath operation, the helicopter decision, and the Marine disaster. And the first General Chief of Staff that I actually can properly remember was Shaul Mofaz, and of course he was the first to wear the first one where they actually changed um, the official uniform from a certain rank upwards. He was there for the withdrawal from Lebanon, the Second Intifada, and Operation Guardian Shield. He was also the Minister of Defense during the disengagement, but we're not here to talk about that one just yet. After him, to finish out the Second Intifada was Moshe Ya'alon, also known as Boogie. That's his nickname, Moshe Boogie Ya'alon. And by the way, I forgot to mention, Yitzhak Herzog, the current president, his nickname is Bougie. Yitzhak Bougie Herzog. That's
Okay.
like I said, weird, crazy nicknames.
Mhm.
And of course, he was then replaced by General Chief of Staff Dan Halutz, which I believe is the first and so far only General Chief of Staff who came from the Air Force, hence the different uniform. He was, of course, in charge of the disengagement, Operation Summer Rain, and the Second Lebanon War, replaced by Gabi Ashkenazi, who of course was the General Chief of Staff during the attack on the nuclear reactor in Syria, uh, Operation Warm Winter, and of course the one that I'm most familiar with, Operation Cast Lead, or Cast Lead Operation, the one I actually remember running away from the bombs. And now we move on to the General Chief of Staff who was in charge while I was in active service, Benny Gantz, who right now is the popular vote to replace Netanyahu once this shit hole of a war ends. He of course, was the General Chief of Staff during the Steadfast Edge and Pillar of Defense uh, operations. There's a whole other thing about the current, the one who's currently Minister of Defense, yeah, Yoav Gallant, who was supposed to take this spot in place of Benny Gantz, but there was this weird story about him actually owning illegal land for some reason. So he was under investigation, so he couldn't be the general chief of staff, so they gave it to Gantz, and he kind of, took it under his nose. And now they're best buddies because they're both the only sane voices of reason in the Netanyahu government, alongside Benny Gantz's immediate successor, Gadi Eisenkot, who is another one of the more sane voices in the Israeli government. Poor dude recently lost his son in the war, and of course his nephew in about a week apart from each other. And actually, I'll say this: one of my last few things that I did as a IDF soldier was being part of this big, grandiose welcoming party for Gadi Eisenkot in the region uh, uh, that I served in. He was a General Chief of Staff during the rise of the Palestinian terror wave between 2015 and 2016. He was part of the House of Cards operation in Syria. He was part of many operations in the Gaza Strip and Operation Northern Shield. He was then replaced by Aviv Kochavi, who actually did a lot. He was part of, again, the conflict between Israel and the Gaza Strip. He was, I don't know why Wikipedia decided to keep this on, but he was he was a General Chief of Staff during the COVID-19 pandemic. He was part of the Guardian Walls. He was part of the Rising Dawn, another wave of terror in 2022, and Operation Breaking Waves. And of course, he was then replaced by the current General Chief of Staff, Herzi Halevi, who was General Chief of Staff during the wave of terror in 2023, Operation Shield and Arrow, and of course the Swords of Iron War, which is still a response to the October 7th massacre. All these names, I promise to you. Well, most of these names will come into play in this proposed topic that I'm
Well,
referring.
my head is hurting.
Imagine mine.
I can imagine.
Yeah. And that's all she wrote.
Okay, so I've already just here's my topic. I think you're gonna love it.
No final thoughts though. First,
Sorry.
no final thoughts on the presidents and prime minister and the.
Well, I mean, there's a fucking lot of them.
Yep.
I mean, honestly, I don't have as much thoughts on these guys as I did the prime ministers because we went more in depth with the prime ministers.
Yeah.
Right. So
because they're more involved in the
yeah,
deciding.
but it was pretty cool to see that one guy also, a couple of those guys also be general chief of staff. So
Yeah. These things kind of meld together perfectly.
Makes sense. But no. So on Monday, after we're recording this episode, is what 50
Easter?
April 1st.
Oh damn!
And what is April 1st besides being Ben's birthday? What is it known for?
The National Boycott Day in Nazi Germany.
April Fool's Day.
I try to block that day from my mind.
So I'm thinking of doing some of the greatest April Fool's Day pranks ever recorded, as a tribute to Ben
In Canada.
in North America. Well, just in general in the world, in honor of Ben, because this is his birthday, and I always love to make him laugh. So I think that's the way I'm going to go.
Yep. Fun fact: my grandma's birthday is the day after.
Oh, nice. My aunt that just passed away recently, her birthday was in April. That's the only one that I know of that had a birthday in April.
When I was in the army, a good friend of mine was her discharge date was April 1st. We were all kind of making the joke that, hey, maybe she's gonna come to get discharged, and they'll say, no, she's actually that was the joke. You're actually staying for another year.
Nice. All right. So that's my topic, and I will just start the send off because I'm getting hungry. And you're probably really tired.
Oh, yes. And we just had daylight savings, so I got very little time left to sleep.
Yeah.
But in any case, so.
All right. Personal Instagram and Twitter, soda_the_Saxman. And as always, on this channel, doing my usual shenanigans with 50 here.
And some of those
75
shenanigans.
today, I guess.
What?
Or 75 today, I guess.
Yeah, thank you. And some of those shenanigans include The Greatest Show in the Galaxy, where we talk about the greatest show in the galaxy, Doctor Who. You can also find me talking even more Doctor Who on my own YouTube channel, 50 Shades of a Geek. I do weekly reviews of every single Doctor Who episode from 1963 all the way to 2023. And of course, now I've also started a brand new project where I react to every single Eurovision song for 2024's Eurovision Song Contest. And you can also check out all the wonderful channels from the wider Benverse at large, such as Something to Talk About, Galaxy Geeks, Multiverse of Geekdom, Movie Lovers Unite, The Midnight Cinema, Time Reviews, and of course, In the Front Row, which is still not pictured in this thumbnail. I wonder how long I'm going to keep this one up. So yeah, anyways, as we've mentioned previously on this episode, we are doing this all for the love of this guy, our good friend and buddy Ben Rayner, who's going to have a birthday in about a week, and we are not here to celebrate with him, but he's here with us in spirit. So yeah, whether you have aspirations to become a prime minister, a president, or a general chief of staff, always make sure to do a good fucking job, and don't ruin your country for your own political interests. Hint, hint. But yeah, so always remember to whichever country you belong to, always let your geek flag fly. That's all we're really here for.
Yep. Amen.
Goodbye.